Καλησπέρα. Έχουμε μια πολύ καλή συνήθεια για πολλούς μήνες να βρισκόμαστε σε αυτή την αίθουσα για το σεμινάριο των διατλαντικών σχέσεων που υποστηρίζεται από την Πρεσβεία των Ηνωμένων Πολιτειών. So, welcome again. And I'm happy that we are joined today by two very knowledgeable colleagues on the topic. Jim Morris, Political Counsel of the Embassy of the United States, and Kostas Tsimonis, professor at Pantheon University, and a very good expert on China. This is, needless to say, this is a topic that occupies a lot of place in the discussion internationally, and also in Greece, among pundits, not so much in the public opinion, despite the fact that there is a quite significant presence of China in Greece. And if we go to the topic of disinformation, propaganda, interference, there also you can find signs of activity, not always very visible, but this is exactly the dangerous thing about it. So I'm glad that we are going to discuss with the two colleagues and you the topic. We'll start with Jim, and then we go to Kostas, and then to you for your remarks and questions. Thank you again.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me and for all of you for coming to spend your time here this evening, and looking forward to your questions and comments. Happy to talk about really anything you want. I've been at the U.S. Embassy since last summer. I've worked for the State Department since 2004, so almost 20 years as a U.S. diplomat. My background is actually more in the former Soviet Union, but I will say that the challenge that is represented by the People's Republic of China is a significant one, and one where I see a very rapid and quick shift going on within the U.S. government, and one that's happening really faster than any that I can remember in my career, as we sort of wake up to the challenge that the PRC, the People's Republic of China, represents to us. So I'm going to talk specifically today about NATO and China, which of course involves US policy in China as well. But really we had a key benchmark last year at the 2022 Madrid summit. And at every summit, there's a NATO strategic concept. And in this last year's strategic concept, the NATO allies recognized Russia as the biggest threat to the alliance. But for the first time, it mentioned China as well. And so this is a really big change for us. And the reason it's a big change is because the United States and the allies have pretty diverse perspectives on the nature of China. European countries rely heavily on trade and investment with China. They don't, as a rule, have security obligations in Asia. And on the other hand, the United States does have significant defense commitments in Asia going back many decades. So what changed things? Chinese behavior during the COVID pandemic, human rights abuses in Hong Kong and Xinjiang, and China's diplomatic and economic coercion in Europe and other parts of the world have really, I think, woken up have really changed the Allies' perspective on China. So what are the challenges that China poses? The first basket of challenges I would mention are in technology. The first is 5G infrastructure. Huawei's emergence as a telecommunications supplier for many countries gives China access to emerging communications networks, and it creates vulnerabilities in all countries in NATO. China, through Huawei, is also proposing a new internet protocol, which essentially is a new set of rules for the international governance of the internet. Second are defense-related technologies, communication systems, computers, intelligence, surveillance, logistical and cyber systems. These are all things that China makes and sells all over the world, and they have a nexus to defense. Cybersecurity. Beijing has the ability to tap into data flows via intercontinental and interregional cables and to hack data from any of these servers. These dependencies, China has also created dependencies in technology through its investments in infrastructure. Through the Belt and Road Initiative, it has extended its supply chains and logistical routes, and also created conditions to advance its standards, practices, and digital flows. More than half of NATO allies have signed BRI-related agreements. That was technology. Second is just overall challenges to the global order. China's maritime claims, space policies, manipulation of information, which you mentioned, and its activities in the Arctic, all threatening key global principles of global governance. So on maritime issues, which I know are always very popular to discuss in Greece, China's claims in the South China Sea restrict the access of neighbors to resources, and they're in contravention to the international laws of the seas. Most of Europe's trade with Asia flows through the maritime passages that are contested by China. Its threats to the integrity of Taiwan present a real risk of conflict in Asia, including through direct confrontation between China and the United States. And its nuclear warheads and missiles can reach all parts of the North Atlantic region. The interests of NATO members are also affected by its ambitions on other fronts. Those challenges include gross human rights abuse, diplomatic coercion and disinformation campaigns, unfair trade and investment practices, and the creation of economic and technological dependencies across Eurasia and Africa. The third sets of challenges I mentioned are specific to Russia, the Russia-China relationship, which we see as sort of closening and growing over time. Beijing and Moscow's declaration of a no-limits strategic partnership and China's pro-Russian neutrality on Ukraine raised concerns within NATO. Greater Russian and Chinese defense industrial cooperation on sensitive technology is also a challenge to the alliance. So those are the baskets of challenges. What do we do to address the challenges? So the NATO strategic concept notes that NATO remains open to constructive engagement with China. Members have also committed to enhance NATO's cooperation with the EU on China. And finally, leaders underscored the importance of working in the Indo-Pacific with like-minded countries like Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, who all attended the Madrid summit, the first time those countries have attended a NATO summit. So more specifically, though, what should NATO do? And these are all things that are sort of being discussed within the context of the strategic concept. NATO allies can enhance information sharing on China to develop a shared assessment of China's strategic goals and methods. They can explore deeper cooperation under Article 2 of the North Atlantic Treaty, which offers a framework to enhance screening of foreign investment in security-related sectors and take steps to protect allies from security-related dependencies on China. And I would just note as an aside that Greece doesn't actually have a foreign investment screening body, although it's something that we've been working with them on for many years to try to develop. So the allies can also conduct a review of defense supply chains to highlight dependencies on China. They can seek to limit China's strategic partnership with Russia by taking advantage of China's concerns over Russia's war in Ukraine and Russia's use of nuclear threats. They can counter China's efforts to subvert the rules-based order. This includes maximizing direct European participation in freedom of navigation operations in Asia. And the allies can strengthen their partnership with the Asia-Pacific partners, including the ones I mentioned, Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, but also new partners who also face similar challenges from China. And also, we should continue constructive engagement with China to explore potentials of potential cooperation, such as the security implications of climate change and pandemic management. So in conclusion, NATO has moved to recognize the Indo-Pacific and European theaters as interlinked and increasingly more connected over time. This will take time. This is, like I said, this is something that occurred at the last NATO summit. And the immediate crisis of the Ukraine war is still NATO's top priority. But it's clear that we're moving in a direction of convergence with the NATO allies and working within NATO to address the challenge of the rise of China. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And let's give the floor to Mr. now, so that we can better engage in the discussion.
So thank you. I would like to thank the organizers and my colleagues here at this. Today, my short presentation has the title China and US NATO, the rise of competing threat perceptions. I think our guest today offered a very interesting overview of the more material aspects of the US NATO China antagonism. I think I'm going to offer more, I will introduce the aspect of perception, which I think is crucial here in understanding where this relation is going to. Now, so I will start with a question which I hope to discuss, and that is whether we have a situation where competing threat perceptions between US and their NATO allies and China are becoming prominent. So are we getting in a situation where we see each other as a threat? I will start with a couple of key concepts, and then I will turn to the evolution of China's foreign policy with an emphasis on the assertive turn under Xi Jinping, and then look at the two sides, China as a threat to US and NATO, but also the other side, US and NATO as a threat to China. And I will conclude with what I will title as the sum of our fears, which is nothing less but a situation of escalation of what we have experienced with the Soviet Union, a new Cold War. Now, policy frames threats, I guess in the audience there are many political scientists, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on those concepts. Just want to emphasize that a threat perception is an extreme form of framing a policy problem. And it is so because it's calling for decisive action. Usually it is linked to processes of securitization, rendering something into a threat. Now, how are threats created? Most threats are not imminent or clear, and this, of course, poses the problem of interpretation. How can we say that something is a threat or not? I mean, we failed to say that with, we failed to come to a common stance on that with Russia, let alone China. Now, the perception of threat is very important, of course, in policymaking, both internal and in foreign affairs. But how exactly do we define a threat? So I think we need to ask a couple of basic questions. So a threat to whom and how exactly do we have a threat? Now, such an analysis, of course, needs to take into consideration the interpretation of international challenges and trends, as well as an assessment of domestic politics that impact on this creation of threat perceptions. So when we talk about the threat, we need to analyze some observed, perhaps material conditions, but also the different policy frames at play. Now, the China and US NATO threat perceptions have been steadily rising since the 1990s. I would say they were fueled primarily by the end of Western euphoria with Chinese reforms in 1989, when we had the Tiananmen massacre, when we actually realized that the Chinese regime is not going to change anytime soon, since it is willing to massacre its own population to stay in power. Now, in the 1990s, the end of history euphoria coincided with the absence of democratization in China and continuing political repression. We had various incidents where, with the Chinese non-participation in the UN vote on Iraq, we had the Taiwan Straits crisis, 1996. I'm sure everyone remembers here the bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade in 1999, and many other incidents, smaller or larger incidents that both sides did not want to escalate. Now, the debate in the West back then was, is China a threat? And there was more or less a consensus in the 1990s that China is still a middle-range power, but of course with great potential. Now, the debate in China back then was, what are we going to do with this deterministic idea of evolution, of a peaceful evolution, that we are doomed one day to replace our communism, or the version of our communism, with a democratic Western kind of regime. Now, in the 2000s, we had essentially China's rise in every single sense. We start in 2001 with the entry to WTO, and we continue with milestone events, China's space program, the Olympic Games of 2008, China's responsible stance both in 1997 and 2008 financial crisis that allowed China to actually come out stronger from both those crises. And overall, during that period, there was optimism. In the West, we're talking about engaging China. We thought that those people advocating containment are exaggerating. Now, in China, during that time, there was a different kind of debate. That was, what are we going to do with our newfound wealth? How are we going to translate all this economic power into a new enhanced position in the world? Now, here comes, I think, a very important Chinese concept that has been interpreted in very different ways, but I think showcases the different interpretations that we can use to understand China's kind of motives, incentives, and direction. And that is the so-called Tao Guang Yang Hui. It is Deng Xiaoping's famous kind of doctrine, which has been translated in different ways. One is to keep a low profile, or to conceal one's strengths and bid one's time, or to keep a low profile and bid your time while also getting something accomplished. So there are different ways to translate that. And of course, depending on the agenda you have, you can focus on different aspects of that phrase. Now, the full text, what Deng Xiaoping said and what was the doctrine of Chinese foreign policy was observe patiently, secure our position, cope with affairs calmly, hide our capacities and bid our time, be good at maintaining a low profile, and never claim leadership. China, for a long time, was saying, and actually Chinese leaders were following that, they don't want leadership in the global state. Now, this, of course, changed, and officially the doctrine was put aside with Xi Jinping. We need to say that there was a wind of conservative change in the Chinese Communist Party already since the end of the 2000s. And Xi Jinping came to represent a generation of leaders who were afraid that despite all this wealth and despite China's rise, actually the Communist Party is losing control. It's losing its ability to direct China to the goal of becoming a superpower. Now, once in control, after in 2012, we had a very substantial domestic centralization, which was especially painful for Communist Party leaders and cadres who had an anti-corruption campaign that led many politicians in China into prison, most, of course, enemies of, or potential enemies of Xi Jinping, who had an extensive deterioration of human rights, whatever kind of human rights existed, and social freedoms, and of course, who have an escalation in the situation in Xinjiang with what we could call cultural genocide of the Muslim population. Now, so is the PRC, the People's Republic of China, finally revealing its true colors? Was that the true idea behind Chinese communism, to bring China to become a world power? Now, we see that indeed China's ambition takes different forms. We have the economic expansion abroad with the BRI. We have a way more defiant position on security issues in the area. So we could say, and there is some credibility to those advocating that China is pushing to become at least a regional hegemon. I will conclude with the two sides of the same coin, which are the threat perceptions between the two sides. Now, so China as a threat to US and NATO. Now, the perception of China as a threat, of course, is informed by different factors, but what China does, but also by the domestic political situation in the US and different NATO countries. We also have an objective difficulty that I didn't experience in my early career, which is the return of the black box logic of Chinese politics. So we have, it's way more difficult to access people, to do interviews, to get inside information. Now, and this, of course, impacts our ability to assess China's political development. Now, when it comes to assessing the more material side, so such as the People's Liberation Army capabilities, it's also quite difficult because the PLA never had it didn't have a recent large-scale military action. We haven't seen the Chinese army fighting, and of course, we don't want to see the Chinese army fighting. And there are vastly different ways to interpret the expanding economic influence. Should we understand the BRI as a zero-sum game? Is there some credibility in China's rhetoric on a win-win form of economic relations? And what does this mean about the world we live in? Do we see the gradual replacement of the liberal world order with an authoritarian Sinocentrism? Now, looking at the other side, US and NATO as a threat to China. Of course, we know that the Chinese Communist Party is communist only by its name, by the name when it comes to its economic program and its development program. But it does remain very communist in the way it functions. Its ideology has been replaced by nationalism, and a nationalism that is extremely xenophobic, and which actually limits, this xenophobic nationalism limits whatever space Chinese leaders have for negotiation. Now, and we see that in the way everything in China's foreign policy is being framed as some sort of a continuation of the historical victimhood it experienced. We see very divergent understandings with the West. So Taiwan is a domestic issue for the US, and NATO is an international issue. South China Sea is a historical claim for China, for the West and for many of its neighbors. It's actually not. It's something that should be settled according to the law of the sea. The East China Sea is also becoming part of the historical Sino-Japanese rivalry. Now, and of course, there is alarmism and fear on China's side about the evolution of the so-called hub and spokes security system in East Asia into a more collective arrangement like the one we have with NATO. So are we moving to the sum of our fears, which is more or less a situation where we see a system of alliances militarily containing China, with China building up and trying to force this containment with violence. Now, we definitely can say that there is a vicious cycle of nationalist assertiveness on China's side, making any kind of negotiation and peaceful resolution of its various problems with its East Asian neighbors impossible. And this, on the other hand, fuels containment from East Asian states and with the help and assistance and growing involvement of the US and even NATO. Now, we do have so the conditions for a typical Thucydides trap, but this takes place in the context of economic interdependence. The world capitalism essentially depends on this relation, which is, I think, a factor that that can create more ground for communication and prevention of a Cold War arrangement. But the biggest fear, what would be the one thing that you're afraid the most when it comes to Chinese foreign policy is the centralization of the party. The extreme centralization of the party. We have a general secretary who, in the first time for approximately 20 years, is in a position to do whatever they want. China has moved from a system of collective leadership to a way more dictatorial system, even for its authoritarian regime. And there is a big question of whether there is anyone within the Chinese Communist Party that can honestly advise Xi Jinping to back down. And this, of course, creates the big risk of misinterpreting capabilities or misinterpreting threat. Thank you.
Thank you both for these comprehensive presentations. Yes, indeed, there are many questions that we can put. We can say that the recent months showed an extreme hyperactivity on behalf of China, exploiting the front in Ukraine. I'm not a specialist, but what we have noticed in the past is that quite an overrestraint on behalf of China when it came to international presence, diplomatic interventions, notwithstanding military interventions. This is, this restraint explains maybe, the attitude of US and European Union not to name China as an adversary, but sticking to the competitor. But But these recent months, I think this has changed. China undertaking a quite active role. I don't know, filling a gap in the handling of the crisis of the war in Ukraine. Feeling that this is the moment after Xi's consolidation in power to demonstrate a more assertive, as you said, Konstantin, stance in international affairs. So these are open questions that I think our speakers would be glad to discuss with you. So now we open the floor for your remarks, interventions. Please present yourselves. I see that Professor Tsardanidis, Konstantin Schinas would like to take the floor. Who would like to go first? Maybe please give me the mic. For Konstantin Bapis or you? Yes.
Okay, do you hear me? Very fine. I'm the director of the Institute of International Economic Relations. I have two questions, one addressing Jim Morris and the other Professor Jim Morris. The first one is that China threat is not only on hard policy. Seems that especially in this part of the world, even in Greece or in other West Balkan states, it's very active in soft policy, in soft diplomacy. And it's trying to create a network of contacts. Given that you have not referred to these aspects of threat, it's possible to say something about and for Mr. Chimonis, and perhaps if you like, you could answer Mr. Morris as well. It seems that there is the Thucydides trap, the famous one. And do you consider that this trap from the United States, one of you, of course, is existential, exists in reality, or it's just a narrative of professional grammatics?
Let's also take the question from Mr. Schinas, former diplomat expert at the NSA.
Konstantin Schinas, former senior expert, chancellor of the Greek Ministry of Foreign Affairs on Russian and Eurasian affairs, retired. Thank you for your presentations, very comprehensive. Babis Tsardanidis stole, quote unquote, one of my questions, was the Thucydides trap. As there is some kind of containment policy of the part of the West, and we are developing the AUKUS system in and around China. And given the fact that the Russian invasion in Ukraine resulted to a closer partnership between Russia and China, this is a game changer for the international system. Besides the same question that Babis has raised, I wanted to ask you, prior to the Ukrainian crisis, we were thinking of the possibility that the rapprochement between China and Russia was leading to some kind of marriage of convenience. The question is it going to continue like that, thinking that perhaps it's a marriage of convenience, and in the medium to long run, one country will look eastwards and the other westwards, in different directions, or not? Thank you.
Please.
So I think I'll start with the soft power question, and then we can shift over here and then maybe shift back for your last question. So I think what we observe is that China's initial round of global engagement and influence focused on economic development and investment as a tool to develop relationships and political leverage. And you saw this with the Belt and Road Initiative, and investment in Africa was very strong, and other parts of the world. But what we've seen in more recent times is a more concerted campaign on soft power. And I think as China is developing its sort of global campaign, it's becoming more effective. It's sort of copying the playbook of the West, but also other playbooks. And so, you know, in countries like the US and also in Greece, you have Confucius Institutes, which seem very harmless, but it's a state-run program that, frankly speaking, is, you know, there's lots of, you know, language instruction and things that are, you know, not, that have educational benefits, but then there's also sort of a healthy dose of propaganda on top of that. In Greece, they're very effective on a narrative about cultural ties and a shared ancient civilizations, so that both Greece and China have these ancient civilizations that they're very proud of, and they've developed agreements with universities and institutes to, you know, trade expertise in these areas. And, you know, I'm always worried about xenophobia and our own, we don't want to label everything Chinese as bad, because like any country, there's a lot to learn and appreciate about China. But what we do see is a state-driven campaign of soft power focusing on education that is getting sort of bigger and stronger over time. In the US, I know there's been sort of more scrutiny of the ties in the academic world, also with Chinese state-run media who are active in the US. So it's something that we're paying more and more attention to. It's certainly, it's a growth industry right now for the Chinese government from our view, and something that I think there's even less awareness of than some of these other issues, like the, you know, more obvious examples of investment in infrastructure and technology and so on. So with that, why don't we turn to the other questions?
Yeah, just want to add on soft power. There is an interesting institutional dimension with especially the party organs getting involved in Chinese foreign policy in different countries. So we have, apart from the Confucius Institutes, that in reality, some of the Confucius Institutes are politicized, others are less so, they're more business driven. It really depends on the case. But we see concerted efforts of the party to influence the diaspora, Chinese diaspora. I was really surprised in August. I think it was when Pelosi visited Taiwan. I was driving my car past the embassy, and I saw at 9 o'clock there was a small Chinese demonstration outside the US embassy. We've never seen that before in Greece. So it looks like there is increased ability of the party to do what it knows best, which is to mobilize, to organize grassroots entities that can influence the narrative, especially in a country like Greece, where, of course, we're interested in China, but in reality, we don't really care, you know, like in terms of the public debate. Now, on the trap, of course, as a student, I was reading your work, Professor Tsardonidis, and I'm really glad that I got that question from you. Of course, Thucydides' trap has a fallacy, which is the zero-sum perception. My win is your loss. So I would say that such a condition exists if we want it to exist. It's primarily a matter of interpretation. So if we said to understand everything that China does as something that we are losing, then of course we are in such a condition. But as we have seen with what talked about, China's kind of role in the differences between Iran and Saudi Arabia, it's not always a zero-sum game. I believe that in the context of interdependence, there are, of course, zero-sum game situations, but also win-win or lose-lose situations that we need to take into consideration.
Thank you.
And then I think the last question is one of my favorites because it was about Russia and China convergence. And so my first experience with this was in 1997. One of the first things I did after university was I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Russia, which is a program that no longer exists for obvious reasons. But and I lived for 2 years in a city called Khabarovsk, which is close to Vladivostok. It's in the Russian Far East. It's 5 kilometers from the border with China. At that time, there was no crossing there, but economic ties were developing, and they were really flowing in one direction, which was China selling cheap merchandise to that region. But on the people-to-people level, there was very deep distrust. There's what I would call historic xenophobia on the Russian side. And, in terms of, people say, well, the Russians aren't really European, they're Eurasian. The Russians do not consider themselves Asian. They would all, I can't speak for all Russian people, but generally they either consider themselves European or a people with their own special destiny. So they do not see themselves as Asian, and there's even without going into too many details, the movement of the Russian Empire east came at the expense of, at that time, what was a weak China. And there are all these demographic differences where you have very open spaces in Eastern Russia with very few people living there, lots of natural resources, and then high population in China and fewer natural resources. So there's this deep distrust. Even the borders, at least at that time, were not fully delineated and agreed on. I'm not sure. They may have resolved those issues since then. I'm not sure. But fast forwarding 20 years later, when I was in Washington before coming here, I was the deputy director of our Russia desk. And when the new administration came in, they asked us this question several times: are Russia and China converging? And this was before the Ukraine war started. And institutionally, we were very skeptical of convergence for all of the regions because there are just limitations in terms of these countries are not democracies, so it's hard for non-democracies to really develop relationships of trust like you have in NATO, for example. So there are areas of cooperation, right? So for example, Russia and China compete in international forum like the UN Security Council. They sort of vote as a bloc on certain issues, which creates sort of more, again, 2 votes instead of 1. But there are also limitations to that. China has never voted Russia's way on issues like Crimea annexation or other issues like that. They compete with each other in certain parts of the world. They compete in Central Asia. But I think what's most apparent is that in the converging relationship that you see now, Russia is really the junior partner. And I think for Russia, that is going to be a real challenge. They're going to struggle with that. They don't want to be the junior partner. So they are, slowly becoming more economically dependent on China. They are looking to build this political relationship. But again, I think it is limited And then on the Chinese side, where I'm less of an expert, there are limitations as well. You can see that they really are very, with the war in Ukraine, they're hedging. They're not providing assistance to Russia. They're not providing military assistance, I should say. They are not condoning Russia's actions. And I think they see that Russia's strategic lack of success so far really exposes the weaknesses and limits of Russia as a partner, that all of this military hardware is maybe not as effective as they thought, and so on. So I think it's, while there is this convergence, I think it has limits, and I would also say that I'm not sure that the NATO or the West really push them together so much as that it's their own actions and paths that have put them together. But again, within pretty strong limits, and you see this in the recent high-level visits where they're still engaged in high-level diplomacy, but the outputs and the agreements, in my view, are still limited, and by this junior partner, senior partner dynamic that I mentioned. So I don't know if you want to add that.
I agree. No, I definitely agree. I was really surprised also with Xi Jinping's kind of body language during his meeting with Putin. It was very evident that you knew who the boss is in that partnership, and it's not Russia. China is not anymore the little brother, and Russia the big brother. This has been reversed.
This is, in fact, this is a reverse of the traditional roles. Because the relationship is not a new thing. And since we are here among students, it's good, I mean, to mention historical facts. There is a fascinating book written by Chris Miller, teaching at Fletcher, actually, about the Chinese-Russia imbroglio from the past.
Mm-hmm.
Because in the past, Russia was the empire. And so he quotes a famous phrase of Dostoevsky, saying that our heart is in Europe, but we know that in Europe we cannot be masters. In Asia, we can be masters, which is not the case anymore.
Definitely not.
So it's the reverse of the traditional roles. And if we go even further, I mean, Putin made the fatal mistake with the invasion of Ukraine because he made China the master of Eurasia now. But he has to pay the price. Anyway, other comments? Mr. Trifilis, of course, a very good contributor to our debates, specialist of maritime affairs. Here you are.
Thanks, it's a pleasure to be here. Thinking about the question you said earlier you made about the recent hyperactivity. There has been hyperactivity recently, but I think it put that in the context, the COVID diplomacy, where China was already very, very active, but which went a bit unnoticed to us. And probably even earlier, when you looked at their economic activity after the credit crisis, where basically the world GDP, world trade kept going because they were the first to pledge about 800 billion for their own infrastructure. So I think that the Chinese, let's say, essential engagement with the world, with influences, outcomes has been, a long time coming. But maybe we can say it's the first time we see the hyperactivity clearly on the state actor or on this kind of, realpolitik area. versus area. So I'm not sure it's that new, but it's now very obvious. And yes, I think this was sped up. I think it was always on the cards, but it was probably sped up more so than China may have liked. Because I think they would like this to have occurred after they completed the tertiary part of the realignment. Offshore even if they are shut out from the South China Sea to be able to be in a meaningful trade with the West or with the countries between Asia and the West, which I think is close to being achieved, especially with the part of the island close to being now. But I think it was also now they have to support Russia in the eyes of what you would call the non-aligned or third world or the developing countries. That is a vast part of the population. In the US, we forget population sizes. If you add even India, Japan in the Western camp, you don't get past 2 billion folks. So that leaves another 6 billion up for grabs in terms of regulating your model or becoming, parts of your system. So I think this is really the goal, the end game, not necessarily through a domination, but anyway, by being a leader of these vast populations. This is, I think, something that's the lowest hanging fruit of the West in reverse, is to start becoming again a champion of freedom, which we said was difficult for the Chinese government to do. Because even if they introduced economic freedom, then they were not willing to introduce political freedom. I think we used to have this, and then we've kind of moved into not so much economic freedom. It was too big to fail, or quantitative easing, and all of these things. And now we're kind of dragging our political freedom a bit backwards. So I think we need to go back to the roots in the West and offer a true alternative to China to come up against some real limitation.
Well, yeah, I think you're absolutely right that we have seen China engaging with the world in a constructive way for some time now. Although I think that the case with mediating between Iran and Saudi Arabia was something new. And something very difficult for the West also to digest, because we are not used in the West to have countries from the global South solving international issues, right? So we need also to reflect on that. And I would like to go back to combine your remarks with the question of Mr. Schinas. Now, the triangle that we had in the Cold War, and that essentially speeded up the end of the Cold War between US, Russia, and China, I think is still something that the West needs to exploit. I think the same logic could apply here, and that's why, although I personally, of course, see China as a challenge, I think that we need to exhaust every possibility for cooperating with China, because it is the only way to really manage to influence the behavior of Russia, but also to avoid any major disruptions of global capitalism, which is what we all care about, right?
In the hyperactivity, I think so much happened during the 2 to 3 years that China was essentially locked down, that we're really in a new period where President Biden met with President Xi on the margins of G20 in Bali. And we see, even this year, this week, I think there was a Chinese official visitor in Greece meeting with the Minister of Education. So, it's coming back. For example, I know the EU has a high-level dialogue with China that is set to resume in the spring, and it hasn't taken place in person for many years because of COVID, essentially. So I think we're sort of recalibrating to all of that, and it's a challenge. And then I agree that of all of the parts of the world where our messages on Ukraine and on China have the least impact, it's in the global South, where governments and people see the advantages of being open to trade and investment globally. They're concerned about rising food prices. They don't really see how the Ukraine war is relevant to their situation. And so we have a real challenge there. I think within the NATO and EU space, that's where there is the closest overlap in terms of with our point of view. And I agree with what you said, that really we need to really double down on our messaging on, our core values, which are essentially, free economies and democratic systems. But it's challenging. I agree with you.
Thank you, sir. You have the floor. Could you please present yourself?
Thank you. Thanks, I'm Walter Granick from the Canadian Embassy. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you. Very interesting and some provocative comments. I think that watching US NATO perspective on China's growing influence globally is interesting. And as we look at the Indo-Pacific as a region, there is a certain approach. If you look at China's role in Europe, you have to take, again, a different approach. If you look at China's role in the Caribbean and through Panama, again, we see a different thing. So to look at the way that China's strategy globally is advancing, we really have to take a global approach. When you look at global integration and global economic integration, we don't have a choice. We have to engage with China. At the same time, we talk about soft power approaches and stuff. But in vaccine diplomacy, we want, for example, there's a perfect example. We'll tie in the Ukraine question. A year ago in Geneva at the Human Rights Council, there was a move to sanction China or Xinjiang, and there were a whole bunch of countries, including Ukraine. Now, the vaccine supply to Ukraine was pitifully low, and they had a deal coming with Sinovac. They put their name on the list to sanction China in Geneva. When that list came out, their name wasn't on it anymore. And all the media in Kyiv was right out there up front. There's no secrets here. The call came from Beijing to Kyiv saying, like, do you really want your name on that list in Geneva? And they took their name off. Now, this is the Xinjiang question, and that's, one approach to solve decent stuff. The other approach is when you've got investments. Now, investments are coming out of China globally. There's not a lot of global investment into China. If you look at the region, for example, it's pretty tough. 6.2 billion, I think, in terms of trade. The two-way trade is 6 this way, 0.5. Right? So the point is, I think you can't live without China for the economic engine that it is globally, but you really have to go in with your eyes open because, things can go really wrong really fast, and it's, when I say that with some confidence because the Canadian example is that the two Michaels were arrested, accused of being of espionage and put in prison for 2 years until such time as the daughter of the Huawei president was released from Vancouver and allowed to leave. And then all of a sudden, she was gone. They were released the next day. So this is a clear case of arbitrary detention that has very little to do with the international perceptions of human rights and respect for those kind of things. You could say that those are great Western concepts, but the further south and the further east you go from Westminster, the less traction. Thank you.
I would, it's not that long ago that if you were reading about the US economic relationship with China, people talked about, something like a G2. And this was an idea that you had these two giant economies that were so interconnected that they would, sort of dominate. And a lot of that is still the case. At one point, the largest holder of US government debt was China. And that may still be the case. And so there's these interdependencies that have been decades in the making. But, speaking as just an observer, I will say that the mood in Washington is changing rapidly in terms of people talk about economic decoupling. Certain, especially in technology, iPhones, for example, being, components being manufactured in China, everything that is being discussed about chips and basically getting, US technology off of Chinese manufactured chips. It's really, this debate is advancing really quickly. And, one issue that always brings a smile to people's faces, but just as an outside observer, it wouldn't surprise me at all if the United States banned TikTok in the next 6 months. This is really happening very quickly. And it's just one example, but on the one hand, TikTok's penetration in the US is very deep, and people of course have I'm sure half of the users don't even know that it's a Chinese company that owns TikTok. And it's, so of course, from a political perspective, if you ban it, you can provoke a political backlash. But it still seems to be advancing quite quickly. So on the one hand, it's hard to imagine how the US economy can decouple that quickly, but there is a lot of political momentum for this within our system right now. And, there's bipartisan support. There aren't, too many issues that the too many main political parties in the US agree on at the moment, but one of them is this. And so we'll see where it goes, but the changes are really faster than anyone I think would have imagined.
Yeah, a brief comment and a brief question for you as well. So of course, with Xinjiang, in the example that you mentioned, we're not talking about soft power. It's clear coercion, right? The clear diplomatic coercion. And it's really shocking because the Chinese Communist Party is getting away with murder, literally. And there is really no appetite in the West to do anything about it. And I'm not talking, TikTok is more controversial than the cultural genocide taking place in Xinjiang in the US right now, which is telling. Now, what I want to ask about Canada is I know that there have been many Chinese companies investing in the oil sector. So have you seen a spillover in terms of political influence or in terms of increased soft power in your country?
But I can talk about, I have 4 kids, I don't really need advice, you know. Yes, the Foreign Investment Review Agency, Canada's independent, sort of an independent government agency that monitors and approves investment in large, or sort of foreign investment large sizes. In fact, in the spring, they locked a deal through a venture. Because the oil and gas it's a large sector. Most of our oil and gas, the pipelines go north-south between Calgary and but the amount of mining interest is growing because of strategic minerals. And there was, in fact, a decision made to stop the sale of to go through. A lot of that kind of stuff, you know, we have to watch. We have, you know, large exposure in Pacific, including China. It's the kind of thing that, you know, you can't walk away from that easily. But like I said, you know, you have to be aware of who your partners are. And, you know, when it comes to it, maybe you should be ready. Watching, just as a sort of an awkward segue, but nonetheless, I like the discussion about the primus inter pares now, and the very obvious role of tea. But that has less to do with the international communist movement. And so I believe the role of China, you know, like he was in Moscow, looking at the situation in Ukraine. And people are disappointed with what he didn't come out with. But on the other hand, you know, you could say that, you know, his restraint and abstaining from saying things actually favors the aggressor. And so, you know, that's why the Western leaders are now beating a path to Beijing. They're saying, like, but what are we doing here?
Okay. Any other question? Yes, please. Present yourself, please.
Visiting professor of geopolitics in University of Louis. Since we are in Europe, I would like to ask both of our presenters. Standing of EU is affiliated between the US and China. Thank you.
Okay. Now, there is a very fragile consensus within the EU about the common stance towards China. There is a very basic agreement on broad things. And that's, of course, because the EU by nature is not hegemonic, right? The EU depends on consensus. And the EU, of course, moves forward and decides a common stance in the topics it can do so, and it doesn't move as one in other topics. And China is such an issue. So we see however, that Xi Jinping's kind of policies have managed to draw the EU and the US closer when it comes to responding to China. Not close enough, perhaps. We still need to convince German industrialists to be more careful with who they're dealing with. But there is definitely some sort of common direction in trying to engage China with a stick, with a carrot, with a kind of combination of the two. Perhaps different countries have different kind of approach to that. But slowly, we see more and more European states not so much forming a common EU stance, but aligning with the US stance on that.
So I think, I focused my remarks a lot on NATO and the challenges that China presents for NATO, which, are significant. But I think in many ways, the US dialogue with the EU is more advanced. And there actually is an actually structured US-EU dialogue on China, where our officials go to the EU and they, sort of exchange views with EU officials. And, the reason for that is really just, who's the right person to talk to. So, if you're talking to people in Europe about telecommunications regulation, data sharing, data privacy, et cetera, it's the EU, right? And so this initial set of challenges that we were dealing with, a lot of it, is the dialogue is with the EU. And I think, it's a bright spot in the US-EU relationship. We don't share, our views 100%. 5G, I think, is a good example of where there was a good overlap of views of what the challenge was. And, it's a very challenging, difficult issue, but, countries like Greece responded well. But, to your point, each country in the EU has to balance its own relationships. I know more about Greece than other countries because I work here, and one thing I hear is Greece can't afford to pick fights with two members of the Security Council at the same time, which makes sense on some levels. And there are other reasons why each country has to follow its own path. If you compare Greece to, say, Lithuania, they're pretty much on opposite ends of the spectrum, where tiny Lithuania did pick a fight with two members of the Security Council at the same time, which was not an easy thing to do. Overall, I think I would say it's a bright spot in the US-EU relationship. But again, each country has its own set of interests. So
there is, if I may use my privilege of moderator, sometimes there is a misperception in Europe that we can choose partners. And okay, we have the luxury, we can go with China, we can go with US. It's not on this basis that we choose allies and partners, because the Euro-Atlantic relationship is not based on economic interests. It's based on values. It's based on history, on traditions. In fact, US, if I may say so, is a European power. The foundations of the US democracy are the foundations of European values. Okay? So our relations go back centuries. And this debate about, okay, and why we cannot have, the liberty to choose China as an economic partner. Because if you choose China as an economic partner, and then China becomes an hegemonic power, it will not stop economic partnership also. I mean, it may ask, I mean, a military partnership. It may ask, I mean, limitation of the freedom of the press. May ask limitation of the democratic standards. So this is something what we need to understand. The discussion in Europe, unfortunately, because of the exports of some countries to China, overshadows this very basic fundamental difference that we have with China. It's not about interest only, it's about the orientation of our societies. Yes. Yes. I understand that you have a point here.
Yes, yes. No, others already here.
Yeah.
Your argument applies also to the United States, because there is interdependence also from economic point of view between the United States and China. China actually is the leading all the debt. A large proportion of the American debt belongs to China. And also China needs the United States market as well as the European market. So in that sense, there is an interdependence. If China, for example, decides, which never, I think, it's not very clever to do that, to sell all the American boats, will you imagine what is going to happen to the American economy? So despite the threats, this is a difference, I think, that there is also an independence. One side is also the threat, the security. By the way, NATO is based basically on security. And of course, there is a common interest in values, but basically was the security issues, and still there are the security issues. So I think there is the two phases which we have to focus. Interdependence does not apply also to the European market, but also to the American market. This was my point.
Yeah, when you mentioned the, Chinese ownership of US owned debt, and you're reminded of the old terminology of mutually assured destruction. I think that a rapid dumping of Chinese owned US debt would provoke, economic catastrophe on both sides. But, if you think about, I certainly hope that there won't be the kind of break with China like we've seen with Russia. But, if you look at the steps that the West took in terms of freezing dollar denominated debt, and, really isolating Russia economically, and the impacts that that's had globally, they would be much larger in the case of China, right? It would be very challenging. So, let's hope that doesn't happen, but it is hard to, you're right, the level of global economic dependency is large.
Any other comment? Yes, please.
I have a more direct question. When you see NATO security moving forward in terms of Chinese technology and NATO security, and my point is more direct to the 5G that you said before, but more into like smartwatches, phones, laptops, especially when government services are using them. And of course, some NATO allies banning them as government property, and then other NATO allies are using them at a high level. And then suddenly you have communications from one government going to another, to devices that one government considers not safe, to the another government considers it safe. How do you see NATO moving forward?
Yeah, I think it's happening very quickly. And, as I mentioned in my remarks, I think there'll really be a look at supply chains and the technologies that are being used. And, I think to some degree, there's just a lack of awareness. And, I could think of very specific stories to tell. I don't want to embarrass any government, but where, a ministry or just buys a bunch of laptops and they're all Chinese, or it installs a bunch of security cameras and they're all Chinese. And this is the kind of thing that's sort of just been happening on autopilot for a period of time. And I think we'll see a big change pretty quickly, because we're really waking up to the fact that all of these technologies really do have a back door that can be exploited. So, in many cases, it's challenging because governments just want to buy what's available or cheaper. And but I will say that, our embassies across Europe, it's like a whole of government effort. We have what's called the Foreign Commercial Service, that is the Department of Commerce, the Department of State, the Department of Defense, all looking at these issues and spending more and more time on it.
So
Other comments?
no more cheap laptops then?
Yeah.
Is that going to be?
Yeah, and again, I think in many cases, it's just a lack of awareness, really, but yeah.
Just to start my point, it was an example from government to go, then you also have the risk of individuals, not everybody can afford to buy an Apple iPhone. And then you have, simple government workers who are buying cheap Chinese products and then going to government buildings, or, for example, 2-3 years ago, with military personnel going on runs around military bases, and then suddenly all of this was on Google Maps and everybody knew the size of military bases and where they were and what was happening.
Yeah, but again, I mean, I think in the last month, the US government told employees that they had to take TikTok off their government phones, and that's out in the public now as well. So there is a pretty rapid rate of change. But yeah, I mean, to your point, if you own a personal device and bring it into work, it's going to be hard to control that completely, right? So, yeah.
Other questions? No? If it's not the case, let us thank you.
Is strategic engagement in us versus that, or is there common ground somewhere to be able to avoid a binary relationship while we're done? Look at a question like climate change. NATO is going into climate change, climate insecurity in a big way. Just wondered, if we go in with our eyes open, is there a way to engage the countries to a strategic advantage?
So yeah, I think climate, health, arms control. Yeah, I do think at some point China will want to talk about Russia in a way that's productive as the war continues. But our leaders continue to meet. It was in just in November that Biden had his last meeting with President Xi. So I think it's still open to cooperation on areas where we intersect, but probably a better question for you.
Space for engagement. Of course, I think there is space for engagement. There should be. We cannot avoid China. We need to learn to live with China and take out of it the best we can, because otherwise global problems such as climate change cannot be resolved. Absolutely. But then, that's why I chose academia. I don't want to be a policymaker. It's very difficult to actually find the right balance between engaging where you have to engage and then confronting China on certain issues that are fundamental to you. And I guess that will make the job of policymakers in the US and in NATO countries very, very difficult in the next decades or so.
This is a topic of a discussion. The turning point will be the role of China in the solution, if any, to the Ukrainian war. This will be the turning point. I mean, if they orchestrate the solution, then we are in a different, we will wake up in a different day. This is why, I mean, we don't have to leave them a lot of maneuvering room. Anyway, on this note, thank you again. Thank you very much. I think we had a very good discussion, very good quality. Thank you. And thank you all of you. The next session will be 26th of April on Greece, NATO, and the US-Greek relations. Thank you.
The first panel.